Comincia la volata finale che ci porterà al traguardo di questa 12ª edizione di Link Media Festival. L'ultimo panel pomeridiano inizia con lo spionaggio. Il titolo del libro che andiamo a presentare, La Spia Perfetta. Un libro che ci presenta l'autore e che è il ritratto più completo e definitivo di Richard Sorge, che Ian Fleming definì la spia più formidabile della storia. Grazie all'accesso a documenti sovietici un tempo segreti, lo scrittore ricostruisce non solo le sue imprese, ma anche il lato umano e tormentato di un uomo che Stalin guardava con sospetto. Dialogherà con lui la giornalista del Piccolo, Valeria Pace.
Figli di nostra madre, vogliamo solo amare, e in questa verità, e in questo dimostrare, tu mi piaci tanto. Tu mi piaci, tu mi piaci, tu mi piaci tanto.
Scrittore, storico, giornalista britannico, abbiamo il piacere di ospitare sul palco di Link Media Festival Owen Matthews.
Ho fatto una canzonetta, un fiore su una camionetta e le botte delle piazze le dimentichiamo.
Andiamo a scoprire La Spia Perfetta. Buon lavoro Valeria.
Grazie per questa introduzione e grazie a voi per essere qui in questa bella domenica a Trieste. Allora, inizierò a presentare il nostro ospite in italiano e poi passeremo a conversare tra di noi in inglese, quindi se avete bisogno della traduzione, come vi è stato spiegato nel video, c'è l'app a disposizione. Il nostro ospite è un ospite di cui siamo molto onorati della presenza, perché ha un'esperienza internazionale incredibile e soprattutto un'esperienza internazionale che ci aiuterà ad avere una prospettiva, insomma, più completa anche sul presente, sugli eventi di guerra che soffiano purtroppo sull'Europa ormai da diversi anni. È stato il capo dell'ufficio di corrispondenza di Newsweek da Mosca e da Istanbul per diversi anni. Adesso lavora appunto è un associate editor allo Spectator, una rivista molto molto famosa inglese, e scrive editoriali, è un editorialista per il Telegraph, ha scritto 9 libri, sia romanzi che saggi, e sono stati tradotti in 36 lingue, quindi veramente un personaggio di alto profilo. Il suo libro più famoso è La casa dei bambini dimenticati, che è stato edito in Italia con Mondadori. Ok, now we'll switch to English to talk about you, but let's start with our protagonist of The Perfect Spy. So let's start from here. Who is Richard Sorge?
Thank you for that very generous introduction and very flattering. Who is Richard Sorge? He was arguably, in my opinion, definitely, the greatest spy of World War II. Sorge was a German communist who spied for Stalin in Shanghai and most famously in Tokyo in the 1930s and 1940s. And the one thing that everybody who knows about Sorge knows is that in 1941, Sorge was able to definitively tell his spy masters in Moscow that Hitler was about to attack the Soviet Union. His spy masters in Moscow did not believe him. Stalin was warned and ignored the warning. The USSR was not prepared for the invasion. What fewer people know is that Richard Sorge had a second and final act of his fantastic espionage career. And that was that in the summer of 1941, while the Germans were attacking the USSR, he was able to tell Moscow that the Japanese would not attack Siberia. Now that sounds like a trivial detail, but actually it was an enormously important piece of strategic information, because if the Japanese had attacked the Soviet Union in the summer of 1941, while the Germans were attacking in the west, if the Japanese had attacked in the east, then, finita la commedia for the Soviet Union. It would have been life-changing. And the fact that Sorge, who is now believed, having been proved correct, was able to warn Moscow that the USSR would not be attacked in the east. Stalin moves 5 army corps to defend Moscow. The Germans are defeated outside Moscow, and the course of the war changes. It's one of the very rare instances of a piece of intelligence, a piece of espionage, properly changing history. So, in one very short sentence, who is Richard Sorge? He is an extraordinarily effective spy. He's a very bad, wicked man. He's a drinker, a womanizer, a liar, but at the same time, one of the most brilliant spies of the 20th century.
Is he a bad man? I mean, I feel, reading the book, I quite liked him. Like, there's a lot of, yes, he's a womanizer, but he seems to care about women in some way. He's not just using them, but let's talk about this relationship, maybe. Is he really a bad man, do you think? I feel like you like him a little bit, don't you?
Well, yes. I mean, I think every historian who writes a biography of anyone, you start to sympathize with your subject. So I personally agree. I mean, I find him rather charming. And in many ways, Richard Sorge is one of the models, has been spoken of as one of the models for Ian Fleming's James Bond. The sort of hard-drinking, very sort of suave, sophisticated, man about town, the sort of hero spy who frequents the casinos and the dance halls and the diplomatic receptions. Sorge has a definite charm. When I say he's a bad man, I think at a profound level, this type of person is as old as history, as old as lying, because he is a man who wants to cover up his sins, his bad behavior, with an ideology that justifies everything. It's the classic Jesuitic principle, is the ends justify the means. Because he is a dedicated communist, because he is fighting the good fight, because he is so committed to protecting the Russian Revolution, he is allowed, because he's a good person, because he's a high priest of communism, he's allowed to do whatever he likes. He's allowed to have 30 mistresses. He's allowed to drive motorcycles around the streets of Tokyo and crash them. He did that a lot. He's allowed to sort of be as badly behaved as he likes because he has a higher purpose. And actually, it's not just self-delusion, because Sorge did think of himself as a soldier. When he was executed, sorry, spoiler alert, he gets executed in the end. Sorry to spoil that for you. When he gets executed, he goes to the scaffold and he says, he stands to attention and he says, "Hail to the Red Army, hail to the International Communist Party." I mean, he considers himself right to the end to be a soldier, even though his battlefield is indeed, the dance halls and the cocktail parties.
And so he really believes in what he's doing, right? And that, as you explain in the book, stems from his life history. maybe we should talk about that. He was born in Baku, in Azerbaijan, and those early experiences were really formative for him, no?
Yes, so it's very interesting to trace the similarities between different great spies. So Sorge was indeed, his mother was Russian. He was born, his father was a German banker, but he was born in Baku in the Russian Empire, the wealthiest, the most dangerous, the most chaotic city during the oil boom years of the 1890s. And he's born, and he spends the first few years of his childhood in the Russian Empire. He doesn't grow up speaking Russian. The family speaks German. The family moves back to Berlin. but throughout his childhood, there is this sense that he's an outsider. And John le Carré writes a very interesting thing about his own personal life and about the characters that John le Carré wrote in his spy books. He said, I could never truly betray because I never belonged. In order to betray something, you have to belong to it. And I never belonged. So I think that's a really important part of why this man should devote his life to, first, communism, and secondly, to spying. The moment for Sorge comes in, as so many of his generation, comes in the trenches of the First World War. Well, he's wounded 3 times. He has extremely painful surgery. The rest of his life, he has a limp. His left leg is several centimeters shorter than his right. He's missing 2 fingers. And in hospital, he's in hospital at the end of 1918, at the same time as a young corporal who is also wounded, gassed, in the next door hospital, and that young corporal's name is Adolf Hitler. And to understand the thoughts of Sorge, I think Hitler expresses them most perfectly in his 1925 memoir, Mein Kampf. He says, I felt that everything inside me collapsed, that everything we had fought for was complete nonsense. It turned out to be completely rotten. The world had been collapsed. And we, our generation, had been betrayed. Our generation had been betrayed. And that burning anger, obviously, we know where that led Hitler ideologically. But it's the same wellspring for the people like Sorge who became communists. It was this idea that the old world had been broken, the new one had not been built yet, as Antonio Gramsci famously said, but he also felt this fury that we need to build a better world. And I think for that entire generation who went through what the Germans called the Kindermord, the massacre of the innocents of the First World War, that deep ideological commitment, not to communism as an abstract intellectual ideal that they chose from a book, but actually as something that was vitally essential for the world, because if we didn't build something better, we would have another terrible Kindermord. And I think for Sorge personally, that experience was completely transformative. And it made him a communist, an absolutely sincere communist, at least for many, many years, until I think the late 1930s, when some things changed in Moscow, which we can talk about, to when he started, I think, to lose his communist faith.
So I think being German was one of, his main asset, probably for the Russian intelligence community. In fact, he manages to infiltrate the Nazi party, which is incredible. And he manages to, in spite of a past of quite publicly held communist views, he manages to infiltrate that organization. Is that, the main reason his Germanness, let's say, and his obviously ability with people, his ability to charm people, his main success feature, or is there something else?
So I told you the end of the story. Let me tell you the beginning of the story. Richard Sorge, after World War I, he becomes a communist activist in Germany. One thing that we tend to forget is that Russia had two revolutions in February and in October 1917. Germany had at least four, maybe five, depending how you count them, 4 to 5 essentially socialist revolutions between 1918 and 1922. Germany was the country in Europe that everyone expected to go Bolshevik, not Russia, actually. People forget that. But Sorge is a socialist communist activist. In the mid-1920s, he, like many young communists, joined the Communist International, the organization, the umbrella organization for all young communists around the world, or all communists, not young and old, moves to Moscow. There he's recruited to first Comintern intelligence, the intelligence branch of the Communist International, and then he's recruited to Soviet military intelligence, known as then as the Fourth Department. We know it today as GRU, Soviet military intelligence. And it is the Soviet military intelligence that sends him to Shanghai in 1930, and then in 1933 to Tokyo. And it's very important to understand this origin story of Soviet military intelligence because it is the first recognizable modern intelligence service ever created in the world. So if you think about spying up until the end of World War I, World War I spies are the same as Herodotus-era spies or Napoleonic-era spies. It's just it's a person who seeks out, who finds secrets, who seeks out people who will betray their leaders, who will tell tales, and that information becomes the currency of espionage. By the 1920s, by the end of the 1920s, there is a man called Jan Berzin. He's a Latvian Bolshevik general, and he is the person who founds Soviet military intelligence with a really crucially important element. Is forensic verification. In other words, facts, like numbers. It's not like, I heard from this guy that this would happen. That's sort of Herodotus level spying. Sorge also does that. But actually, one of the most important things and what makes Sorge so valuable is that he's also gathering the actual nuts and bolts of of practical intelligence. And he begins his career as a spy in Shanghai. How does he go to Shanghai as a Soviet spy? As Valeria correctly alluded, he decides, or Berzin, his boss, says, we're not going to give you any cover story at all. You have no cover story. Your cover is you are Richard Sorge. You're going there as a German, and you're going there as a German journalist, which is, by the way, exactly what he is. I mean, he begins a little bit as an academic, but he's writing academic articles and then journalistic articles through the 1920s. So he's sent by his Soviet spy masters to Berlin to join the Nazi Party, which he succeeds in doing. In fact, this is 1933, so the Nazis, in fact, just come to power, I think, for a communist, first public communist agitator inside Germany and a known communist international agitator living in Moscow. 1936, 1937, I think that would have been more difficult after the Nazis established themselves in power. In 1933, Sorge is able to become the only person in history, as far as I know, who was simultaneously a member of the Nazi Party and the Soviet Communist Party. He also goes around various newspapers and offers to contribute to the newspapers free articles, essentially. And eventually, he starts with small trade magazines and publications, because interestingly, for an interesting economic reason, the German press is very interested in wheat and grain prices in Shanghai. I mean, it's just market information that is important for Germany. So he starts to write these technical, I've read some of them, unbelievably boring articles about Chinese grain production. But nonetheless, it gives him the story. It's not a cover story. It's the true story that he is a German journalist writing for real German publications in first Shanghai, and then he goes to Tokyo. And in fact, ultimately, he starts to work for the Süddeutsche Zeitung, which is a very famous and well-established paper. So not Süddeutsche, Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung, which is then called just the Frankfurter Zeitung. But the idea that a senior spy who becomes ultimately the head of a very sophisticated espionage network inside Tokyo, which is a very paranoid and espionage-phobic society, he does it by hiding in plain sight. He doesn't pretend to be anyone else apart from what he is. It's just that he has several faces. He is a man of many faces. And the face that he turns to the world is as a journalist. And the secret face, which is as a Soviet spy, he keeps private to himself.
So I think the book has several layers. One of them is, of course, the very interesting story of this, extraordinary figure of this spy, of which we'll talk about some more. But another aspect is getting a full and nuanced view of the history of these extremely fluid and interesting times when Europe was on the cusp of a new war. And as we were speaking beforehand, alliances were shifting, and the world could end up in very different could go in very different directions from what we are, used to think. We used to thinking that there were some stable alliances, Italy, Germany, Japan, versus, Great Britain and the Americans. But the history could have gone differently. And another feature that I find really interesting in your book is getting a view of how a global history kind of perspective, getting to know how what happened in the Far East really was so crucial to what was happening in Europe. It's surprising that a spy operating in Tokyo could tell Stalin Germany's plan, isn't it? How does that work?
Yes, so that's a very good question, Valeria. So let's just think about, what is your job if you are a spy for the Soviet Union in Tokyo in 1933? What is the question you're trying to answer? What is your job? So your job is primarily to tell Moscow what this new, very aggressive, very technologically advanced, and very politically unknowable or unknown Japanese empire, what are they going to do in the Far East. And specifically, question number 1, 2, and 3, and every question comes back to, are the Japanese going to invade the Soviet Union? They've already invaded China, they've invaded Korea, they've already invaded, well, they've invaded Manchuria, then they've taken more of northern China. It's a very aggressive, very militarily effective empire on the eastern flank of the Soviet Union, which, may I remind you, actually goes all the way to the Pacific, and in fact continues for 2 time zones to the east beyond Japan, by the way. The final easternmost time zone of the Soviet Union is the same time zone as Perth, Western Australia. It's a very big country, and a large chunk of it, the largest chunk of the Soviet Union, is in Asia. It's not in Europe. So therefore, Sorge's job is to have political intelligence on what the Japanese are up to. How does he do that? He does it by recruiting a Japanese journalist, a Japanese communist called Hotsumi Ozaki, who he first meets in Shanghai, recruits him, Ozaki, as a spy. Ozaki goes up a very well-known career ladder for many journalists. He goes from journalist to analyst to like think tank member to government advisor. This is not unknown in our world today. I mean, it does happen. This is what journalists tend to do as they go up the career ladder, or the lucky ones. That's exactly what Ozaki does. So Ozaki starts off as a journalist and Soviet spy. By 1940, this guy is a senior government advisor, and he's having breakfast with the prime minister and his advisors every single day. So that's a good agent to have, you know. Sorge has got a fantastic agent in place, looking deep in the heart of the Japanese establishment. That's fantastic. But there's another track that Sorge pursues, and that is a personal friendship with the man who is about to be appointed as the German ambassador to Japan. So given that the future world is going to be dominated by this axis of Germany and Japan's, and obviously some other countries, there were actually, it was as vital to know what is happening in Germany as is happening in Japan. Sorge, because he becomes a close personal friend and then an advisor to the German ambassador, is able to also understand what the Germans are doing. Not only just the Germans are doing in relation to the Japanese, but what the Germans are doing in general, because the German ambassador, Eugen Ott, speaks very regularly to Hitler. He's a major general, he's a senior military figure. So Sorge is able to, through his personal friendship with Eugen Ott, the German ambassador, through his agent in the Japanese government, to create a very interesting structure of information that goes in a spiral. So he gets the Japanese political gossip from his Japanese agent. He tells his German friend the Japanese insider gossip. Sorge gets a reputation for being an amazingly well-informed Japanese analyst. He gets told what the European gossip and the strategic situation is by the German ambassador. He passes that to the Japanese. So Hotsumi Ozaki, whose expertise is Western Europe, gets a reputation for being amazingly well-informed. This guy is amazing. He knows everything about Western Europe. And this information goes back and forth, but in fact, there's a third silent observer of this information spiral, and that is, of course, the Soviet Union, because Sorge is reporting both sides up to Moscow. That's what makes him an amazing spy.
And this makes me think of one of the most curious facts that come out of your book. And that's the fact that Richard Sorge somehow is most popular in Japan, whereas in the Soviet Union, he was completely forgotten for a really long time, and rehabilitated only, I forget, in the 60s or something like that.
Yes.
So this brings me to another question. Maybe as time is running out and 45 minutes really aren't enough to talk about Sorge at all, your book is not the first book to be written about this exceptional figure. The real innovation in this was giving the West a view of what's contained in the Soviet archives, in the Russian archives now. So can you tell us a little bit about this? Like, you graduated in history from Oxford, so you're an excellent historian as well. Can you tell us a little bit about the process and the real innovation in writing this book?
So I'll tell you the most interesting thing that I discovered about Sorge from the Russian archives. It's very simple. What Sorge, the excellent spy, told his masters in Moscow was not what his boss in Moscow told Stalin. Two different stories. In other words, Sorge had established one of the best intelligence apparatus in the world. He was not alone. The children of Jan Berzin, the spies that Jan Berzin infiltrated into Berlin, into Washington, all over the world. Berzin, the creator of Soviet military intelligence, was the architect of one of the greatest and most sophisticated international espionage networks, of whom Sorge and his Tokyo spy ring were just one part. However, what Stalin cared about much more was not excellent intelligence. He cared primarily about loyalty or disloyalty. And for essentially political reasons, between 1937 and 1939, every single agent of Soviet intelligence around the world was summoned back to Moscow and shot. Shot. They literally executed their entire global intelligence networks themselves, except for a weird fluke. They did not execute Richard Sorge because he didn't go back to Moscow when they asked him to. But nonetheless, this atmosphere of paranoia was so profound that by the time we get to 1941, and this question arises, is Germany going to attack the Soviet Union? When the warnings start to come from Tokyo, from Sorge's agents, sources in the German embassy in Tokyo, the man who is receiving this information, the head of Soviet military intelligence, the successor of Jan Berzin, his 5 predecessors, including Berzin's successor, his second successor, his third successor, his fourth successor, they have all been shot. One famously lasts from the 10th of August 1938 to the 20th of August 1938. Shot. So if you are the head of Soviet military intelligence and your 5 predecessors have been shot, what is your number one priority? It is not to be shot, basically. I mean, that you will do anything to avoid the fate that has befallen your 5 predecessors. And what does that anything mean? It means not telling Stalin anything that he doesn't want to hear. So the most important and the terrifying conclusion was from the archives is exactly the ways in which an intelligence organization can filter and distort the real picture for political means. And if this is sounding familiar, it should, because it's very clear that democracies are not immune to this. If you read Bob Woodward's plan of attack, his account of how the American intelligence establishment basically sort of created this sort of tissue of not really lies, but just sort of nonsense in the run-up to the US invasion of Iraq in 2003, you realize that actually political will can actually totally distort the accurate functioning of even an enormous intelligence apparatus like the CIA and the Defense Intelligence Agency. It happened in America. Those agencies, which cost tens of billions of dollars a year, they just came up with a crock of nonsense. They told George Tenet, the then director of the CIA, that Saddam Hussein was pursuing weapons of mass destruction. He wasn't. It was bullshit. It was not true. But nonetheless, if you look hard enough for it, you will find some evidence. It happened in 2003, and it happened again very clearly in 2022, because Vladimir Putin, it's very clear, was told by his intelligence sources, by his political friends inside Ukraine, he was told, basically, he went to war on 5 wrong assumptions. One, that a large chunk of the Ukrainian people would support a Russian invasion. 2, that a large chunk of the Ukrainian military and political elite had been bought out. 3, that Europe would not react in any way. 4, that his army would, that the Ukrainian army was totally useless and corrupt and would completely collapse. And fifthly and finally, he was told that actually, that Zelensky and his cabinet would do exactly what Viktor Yanukovych had done a few years before and just, flee the country. All of that was wrong. Vladimir Putin also has, a very significant and very expensive intelligence apparatus. It was mistaken. So that was the most interesting, I think, important and consequential part of my research for this book, is to understand the mechanisms by which, very sophisticated intelligence agencies can be distorted by political misguidance and by political misunderstanding.
So that I think that brings me to my next question, and I have so many, and I see that the time is running out. So hopefully we'll get to also talking a bit more about the war in Ukraine and your view of Putin, because you're a really qualified and incredibly informed observer of all things Russian and Ukrainian, also for familiar reasons. But I was wondering, why Sorge, and why writing a book about Sorge in the 2020s? Is it because some parts of his biography resonated with you, as in he's a journalist, he's half Russian like you, you say it right at the outset, some parts of your family history are related to being able to have survived thanks to Sorge's intelligence, right? Or is it because the present moment calls for us to think a bit harder about intelligence and spies and how that whole process works?
That's a great question. I'm attracted to people who find themselves at a hinge point in history, and especially people who find themselves at that historical hinge point, the inflection point, the moment where history can go in different directions, but also have some influence on that process. And that's why Sorge is such an interesting character, because he stands at a point. He finds himself in a world where the future can go in radically different directions. We, looking back on World War II, we can draw on a chalkboard who was on what side of World War II. That's just very basics. in 1939 and 1940, it's not clear who the combatants of World War II are going to be and what side they're going to be on. It's not clear who is going to be on which side in the coming World War. It's crazy, because famously from September of 1939 until July of 1941, the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany are allies, or at least they have a non-aggression pact, discussed, but it's a long story. But Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union are together. The Soviet Union is supplying Nazi Germany with a huge amount of raw materials. It's powering the Nazi war machine, ironically. Japan is allied with Nazi Germany, but Japan has a non-aggression pact with the USSR. And in the summer of 1940, right through the summer of 1941, a large section of the Japanese government is trying to explore a non-aggression pact or even an alliance with the United States of America. Because Japan doesn't want to go to war with America. The reason why Japan does go to war with America is because they come to believe that America will never allow Imperial Japan to create its empire in Asia and in the Pacific. Therefore, they have to preemptively attack the Americans at Pearl Harbor in order to stop that happening. But that's only after like a story of many, many months of like failure of diplomacy. So if you're Sorge and you find yourself in Tokyo in 1940, you don't know which side of the war. Is Japan going to be in an alliance with America? Possible. Totally possible in 1940. Is it going to honor its alliance with Hitler? Is it going to honor its non-aggression pact with the Soviet Union? Is the Soviet Union going to remain an ally of Nazi Germany? I mean, if you look at the world from that moment, it's very different from the world that we see in retrospect. And Sorge finds himself at this moment of like crazy possibility. He's not running a country, but he does have this possibility of at least giving secret information to one side, in other words, his Soviet masters, and actually trying to influence a little bit the outcome of this extraordinary moment of historical possibility. And I find that just as an intellectual exercise, as a sort of personal thought experiment, really fascinating that somebody could find themselves in a world which is about to fly off in a totally unexpected direction.
So, are we in a similar inflection point right now? You know, what we thought was an unbreakable alliance, the United States with Europe, with the NATO project, is itself in peril at the moment. Are we at a similar inflection point?
I don't think we're. I don't know. Basically, no, I don't think we are, because I think the United States and NATO had the European part of NATO had a much worse crisis under de Gaulle, when de Gaulle forced the Americans to withdraw their troops from France. To which, by the way, the U.S. ambassador said, "Does that include the 60,000 Americans who are in the cemeteries?" Touché. I don't think that we're at the same level of geostrategic crisis where America and NATO are concerned. I think we're definitely at the same kind of tipping point in terms of a great power of Asia rising. But I don't think that necessarily, well, let's hope that doesn't necessarily require a military intervention or empire building the same way as Japan in the 1930s.
Let's hope so. So I want to pick your brains on the Ukraine scenario. What do you think Putin's thinking is right now? And do you think peace in Ukraine is in sight?
It's devastatingly obvious, and has been for some time, the way that the Ukraine war will end. It's totally beyond doubt that Ukraine will be partitioned, and that Ukraine will have some kind of security guarantees from the West, short of but not including NATO membership. That's how the war will end. The only thing that really is a question is the extent to which Putin is able to secure some kind of political control over Ukraine's future. He currently, I can't tell you what he's thinking, but the elements of his decision-making are also pretty obvious. It's a cost-benefit analysis. How much pain can the Russian economy take and the Russian society take in exchange for these gains that he thinks that a future political collapse in Kiev will bring him. Unfortunately, I don't think there's really anything to play for. There's no really gigantic difference that could conceivably happen, even if the Zelensky government leaves or falls, which it definitely will do, because I think Zelensky is actually becoming quite deeply unpopular. There's less than 6% of Ukrainians have expressed support for him as a future president, even though a larger figure support him right now. Anyway, I don't think anything really changes. I don't think Putin has anything left to play for. So in that sense, they actually have there's a terrible sort of Groundhog Day element to this end game of the war. No one is really gaining anything on the battlefield. There's no really serious chance of a major breakthrough. Military analysts say that, in fact, the Russian military machine is not really capable of any significant breakthrough. Therefore, we're just in a deadlock, and I think it ends either when the Ukrainians actually punish the Russian economy through their drone strikes and smash their ability to export oil and gas. That's a possibility. That's something that could change. It's conceivable that a Democrat-dominated Congress could actually impose serious sanctions on Russia. That's another thing that could change. But ultimately, the shape of the partition of Ukraine is already set. That's where the border is. It's going to be along the line of control.
Owen Matthews con la sua Spia Perfetta per la prima volta a Link Media Festival, lo ringraziamo anche Valeria Pace, l'autore.
Grazie.
Ovviamente è a disposizione nella libreria di Link Media Festival alle nostre spalle per il firmacopie. Tra 15 minuti il terzultimo panel.
Grazie a tutti.
Ho fatto una canzonetta, un fiore su una camionetta e le botte delle piazze le dimentichiamo. Ho fatto una canzonetta, spero che non vi spaventi, che possiamo...
Da Trieste all'Adige e alle Alpi c'è una voce che dà forma alle notizie, spazio alle persone, attraversa e connette le città. È la voce di Nord-Est Multimedia. Con un portale digitale e 6 quotidiani radicati in 8 province di Veneto e Friuli Venezia Giulia, racconta le storie delle